There are very few moments in history that we can truly describe as a turning point, an event that decisively changes the course of a nation's future and destiny. Although rare, these occasions are monumental, often becoming major subjects of historical analysis. One of these defining turning points is Napoleon's conquest of Egypt. By gaining control of the Eastern Mediterranean, Napoleon sought to strengthen France's trade routes and weaken Britain's access to India. Whilst initially successful in occupying Egypt and parts of the Levant, Napoleon's army would eventually be driven out by Anglo-Ottoman forces within only 3 years of the operation. Militarily, the expedition in Egypt was a failure for Napoleon, and the general-turned-emperor had more pressing matters to attend to in Europe, where he would have far more success. But whilst Napoleon's wars in Europe are by far the most talked about and analysed, it is perhaps the lesser-known Egyptian campaign that made the biggest impact on world history. It is from just those 3 years of French occupation that the entire political landscape of the Middle East changes. Before we begin, I just want to let you know that this video is the first of a series about modern Arab intellectual thought that will be made in collaboration with the YouTuber Sultan Skinny, who wrote and researched this script. Go check out his series on Middle Eastern history and politics, which documents the beginning of Arab and Islamic civilization to the Al-Nahda period, of which our series will take place in. Also, this video is part of Project Middle East, but more on that at the end. In the late 1760s, the Mamluks, a military caste that had held political power in Egypt since the 13th century, rebelled under the leadership of Ali Bey al-Kabir and succeeded in declaring independence from Constantinople. Although this lasted for only 5 years, Ottoman central authority in the Arab world was under threat, with rebellious leaders in northern Palestine being a constant thorn in their side during this period as well. When Napoleon and his army landed on the shores of Alexandria in 1798, the Ottoman Egyptian authorities thought little of their advancements. Arrogant in their military strength, the Mamluks were confident that their cavalry would easily trample the invading Franks, just as they did in the last crusade. However, when they confronted the French armies, they were quickly overwhelmed. At the time, Napoleon's forces were the most professional in the world, and as they were flexible in their strategies, the Mamluks remained stuck in their centuries-old cavalry tactics. The defeat of the Mamluks at the hands of the French was not so much technical as it was structural. Napoleon's army had adopted innovative tactics regarding corps divisions, mobility, and the usage of artillery, while the Mamluks simply charged at their enemies with little to no strategy or command structure. This demonstration of superior French militarism was a shock to not just the Mamluks, but the entire Ottoman realm. The Ottoman Empire had for centuries seen itself as superior to Christian Europe in every aspect of governance, military, and culture. But with this swift defeat of the Khilafah's armies, the Muslims had a sudden realization of their own inferiority. For Napoleon, his victory over the Mamluks was simply destiny. He convinced his army and subjects that he had come to Egypt in order to liberate its people from the despotic Turks and Caucasians who had ruled the region for over 500 years. Napoleon even went so far as to proclaim himself to be more of a Muslim than the Mamluks he had defeated, showing great admiration of the Prophet Mohammad and encouraging the involvement of religious leaders in his own political circles. However, despite his flattering stances, Napoleon very much saw his campaign in Egypt as a civilizing mission, and local rebellions to his authority were met with extreme violence. Whilst much of the Egyptian public expressed their frustration to the French occupiers, Many Egyptians also saw this period of colonial rule as a valuable lesson for their nation. They witnessed the technological and societal advancements that the French brought with them and began to ponder about how and why their society stagnated whilst the Europeans progressed. Humiliated by the shortcomings of their nation, many Egyptians began to accept the French narrative of Ottoman incompetence and impiety. As the Caliphs of the Ummah, the Ottomans were tasked with the responsibility of maintaining Islamic prosperity and supremacy. But now, with France and the rest of Western Europe proving to be far more sophisticated in their customs and technology, the Ottomans had essentially failed the Muslim community. As a result, Egyptians, both Muslim and non-Muslim alike, began to resent the rule of Turks and looked to Napoleon's France as the new model of modernity. During his occupation, Napoleon had implemented institutional reforms to Egypt's administration, education, and military in a way that suited France's imperial aspirations. His military would include its own Mamluk cavalry corps, which would serve the French imperial army throughout its campaigns in Europe and Asia. The courts would continue to have a place for Islamic clerics, but French civil law was introduced as the backbone of this new government, which in turn changed the status of religious minorities from zimmi to equal citizens. To ensure the Francification of Egypt, Napoleon invited a large number of artists, engineers, intellectuals, and scientists to not only propagate the values of the Enlightenment, but also to conduct studies on Egypt's geography, history, and people. Studying in the French-established Institut d'Egypte, Napoleon's regiment of scholars documented the discoveries they made in the multi-volume Description de l'Egypte, which at the time was the largest publication in the world. This contained artwork and detailed descriptions of Egypt's animals, cities, landscape, history, and people. With the finding of the Rosetta Stone and other ancient artifacts, Napoleon's expedition set the foundations for the modern field of Egyptology, reinvigorating the glory of Egyptian civilization to both the Europeans, who saw it as a mysterious and exotic land, and the Egyptians who called it home. The reintroduction of ancient Egyptian history brought a sense of pride to the people of Egypt, who were beginning to see themselves as members of a unique and separate nation from that of the Ottoman Empire. The French had the habit of calling the local Bedouin tribes Arabs, which was something that the locals would rarely call themselves. They were Arabs in the sense that their tribes had their origin in Arabia, but the idea of identifying as an Arab people was not something that was at the forefront of their vernacular, as they usually referred to themselves as Ottoman subjects. However, with France now having a monopoly on Egyptian politics, education, and history, the social fabric of Egypt was catering itself to a European model of nationhood. To promote and propagate his civilizing mission, Napoleon introduced the printing press to Egypt, publishing articles in French, Greek, and most innovatively, Arabic. Although ridiculed by Egyptian scholars for its terrible grammar, the Arabic presses of Napoleon's Egypt were the most advanced in the Muslim world. Even though they were prevalent in the Ottoman Empire, the usage of the printing presses was mostly limited to elite Christian and Jewish merchants. Being a cursive calligraphy, Arabic was always far easier to handwrite than to print. But with the rapid production of literature and the need to become more European, Arabic printing presses were slowly becoming normalized in Egypt. With the introduction of new technology, philosophies, and approaches to state building, the French were setting the standards for what a modern nation should look like. Whilst initially opposed to the foreign occupation, Egyptian intellectuals and students were beginning to warm up to the French, as their advancements in science, administration, and philosophy inspired them to improve their society. Napoleon, however, would never see the fruition of his efforts. By 1801, the Turkish armies and British navy expelled the French back to Europe and reinstated Egypt as an Ottoman province. In spite of being ousted from Egypt, the impact of the French occupation would forever influence the nation. The administrative, military, and technological reforms of the French were now becoming normalized in Egypt. The Institut d'Egypte continued being the province's main scientific institution, educating students on Enlightenment philosophy and science. The French language was promoted as being an essential skill of the modern thinker, and French administrative law and jurisprudence continued to undermine Islamic law decades after Napoleon's departure. The printing presses not only remained in use, but their utility was expanding to nearly every fabric of Egyptian society, greatly improving literacy rates, increasing the publication of literature, and slowly adapting the Arabic language into the modern standard script that is still in use today. Most importantly, the excavation of ancient Egyptian artifacts and the publication of the Description de l'Egypte reintroduced the West to the wonders of Eastern civilization. Europeans were fascinated by the exotic history and culture of the Eastern Muslim world, with authors and artists depicting the Muslim people and cities without even having visited them. This Western fascination and alienation of the East led to what we now call Orientalism, in which the people of the Orient, and more specifically Muslims, are depicted by Europeans as both captivating and threatening, a phenomena that remains very much prevalent to this day. Despite this explicit act of colonialism, the Egyptians who became the subject of European anthropology, propaganda, and imperialism did not view this era of occupation as a scar on their history. In fact, for Egyptians and much of the Arab world, Napoleon's invasion of Egypt was seen as a step forward. The arrogant Ottomans and Mamluks who thought themselves as the epitome of imperial power were humiliated by the likes of the Europeans they once saw as inferior. This defeat was a wake-up call to the Muslim world that they were in need of reform. This reform would not just be regarding Islamic governance, society, and technology, but more radically, Muslim identity. Identifying oneself as Arab was becoming increasingly common, despite the nationality not really being defined. Secular governance and education was isolating Islamic principles in spite of still being a majority Muslim society. The reintroduction of Egypt's history was reinvigorating a past pride that would determine the future for millions. This philosophical and political shift in the Muslim mind was confusing, but ever so stimulating to think about. In Western academia, this period of Egyptian rethinking is often called the Arab Renaissance, or the Al-Nahda. But to the people of Egypt and much of the Arab and Muslim world, this era was not so much a rebirth as it was rather an awakening. Relieved from their slumber, Islamic civilization was now on a course towards progress, and the question of what this progress should look like would forever shape the political climate that our world faces today. Thank you guys for watching. This video is part of Project Middle East, a collaboration between a bunch of different history YouTubers about the rich history of the region. Make sure you check out the rest of the playlist. As usual, a big thank you to my patrons for continuing to support the channel. And once again, shout out to Sultan Skinny for his help with the video. Check out his channel for more Middle Eastern history. Until next time, peace!